Hi everybody, welcome back. Hope you all are doing well. Today we are talking about roles in groups. This is a lecture for my organizational communication as well as my group discussion courses, but can apply to almost any group interaction. So really today talking about roles and not so much the different names for the different roles. There's a list. There's lots of lists. You can look through the textbook if you're in my class. If you're just watching this in your free time, you can Google different group roles and find lists of all different types and all different categories. But this lecture really is going to focus more on some of the larger overarching kind of ideas that relate to roles in groups. I personally can think of myself as being pretty flexible when it comes to different roles in groups. For me, it really depends on what the group needs and what my strengths are. I've held all sorts of different roles, from leadership roles all the way into really simple kind of like note-taking roles. It really just depends, and part of that is because I have learned about this through my time both teaching and in learning about communication studies and trying to understand how we can communicate effectively in a variety of different situations. And part of that is understanding our role and what the group needs from us, depending on if it's small group, large group, organization, team, whatever it might be. So the particular terms that we're going to talk about today are role status, role conflict, role adaptability, system disturbance, and group socialization. So just 5 things, should be pretty simple, pretty short lecture, but each one of these things is really important for gaining a deeper understanding of how groups, teams, and organizations function. So when we're thinking about role status, we want to think about the relative importance, prestige, or power accorded each group role. So when we have different types of role status, we have different values based on that role, and this is really a perceived value based on that one role. So how important is that role within the group? You might have one group where it's super important that you have somebody who is facilitating, who's organizing meetings, who's working with everybody to figure out what works with everybody's schedules. You might have a different group where that role doesn't even exist because everybody has the same schedule. You can confidently figure that out. You're in the same place at the same time, and you might just need to pop into somebody's office and say, hey, can we do a really quick 10-minute meeting right now? And everybody can do that. So it just depends, right? So role status depends on the group, the value placed on that, the perceived value placed on that thing. But naturally, higher perceived value leads to higher perceived importance and overall a greater influence on the group. So if you have a position of higher influence, a position of higher authority, a position of greater or higher value within your group, you have a greater influence on whether or not the group functions effectively. So you have to take that into consideration when we're thinking about our roles and role status. This is really important because sometimes we have roles that conflict, and this is called role conflict. This is when roles contradict, influence, or negate each other. And it's super important that we're thinking about how our roles conflict with each other, simply because this impedes the group's ability to be effective if what we're doing in multiple roles is negating the work at every turn. So just for example here, when I was at Sacramento State University working on my bachelor's degree, I was a member of the baseball club, the competitive baseball club there. And just if you're not familiar, there's the collegiate team, NCAA team, there's the competitive club team, which is what I was on, and then there's like intramurals below that. So the competitive club, we were funded and supported by the university. We were allowed to wear the university colors and all of that stuff. But in doing that, we ran the club, we ran the organization, and we had certain roles that were required by the university that students had. So we had to have a president, a vice president, a safety officer, a treasurer. Those were the primary roles that we had to have. My second year in the club, I ended up in a position where I was president, treasurer, safety officer, secretary, as well as travel officer. So I was basically doing everything. And at the time that seemed okay, but then the university came along and said, actually, you can't do that. because some of these roles that you have, they conflict with each other. You can't be the president and the treasurer, because then there's no oversight over what's happening with organization or club funds. So we have role conflict there. So that's just one example of how role conflict can impact our ability to be effective and to function as a group or function as an organization. So we have to be thinking about that. Simply because when we have role conflict, that means that we're going to have power imbalances, we're going to have inconsistency, and those power imbalances are inevitably going to lead to dissatisfaction within the group. Now, at the time, I wasn't as firm in my understanding of how this worked, and so I was having a lot of issues on the team. We're having a lot of dissatisfaction. People weren't feeling involved, and that's because I wasn't creating a space for them to be involved. I was doing everything. And then when the university said, hey, if you want to have your club, you want to play, you want to do the stuff that you want to do, you have to have different people for each one of these roles. And what that required me to do is go to the team and say, if we want to do this, other people have to take these roles. And then other people took on those roles, some of them begrudgingly, and we ended up having a really successful season. We didn't win a lot of games, but we had a very successful season as an organization, and really increased the satisfaction and overall success of our group. So when we're thinking about role conflict, we have to be thinking about altering the roles that are held by different people. So I was the president of the club. That wasn't a role that anybody else wanted, and I wasn't really looking to give that role away. So we had to find people for other roles. We had to find a safety officer, a treasurer, a travel officer, a vice president, a secretary in order to run the organization. What that required of each one of those people was that they be adaptable to their new roles. So they went from just being a member of the club to having a leadership position in the club, and that required some role adaptability. Now, this just requires that we're comfortable, we're flexible, we're dynamic in what we do in our groups, in our organizations, and we're willing to take on different roles. So like I said earlier, I have taken on a variety of different roles in different organizations, whether that be kind of a new member role where I'm just taking on kind of simple tasks, the things that nobody else wants to do, all the way up into a leadership role in the baseball club. So role adaptability requires that we vary and that we are dynamic in the way that we're thinking about our roles. And this goes hand in hand with role flexibility. That's the ability to identify and change based on the needs of the group. So again, this is something that I exhibited without even really knowing when I was running the baseball club, because my first season with the baseball club, I was a safety officer and vice president. And I really liked those positions. Vice president, I really didn't have, I had influence, but I wasn't the final factor in what the club did. I didn't have as much responsibility. And then second year comes around, the person who was the president graduated, and we had a meeting where we had to pick a new president, and nobody wanted to do it. And it got down to we had to decide otherwise who was going to be the president, otherwise we weren't going to have a club. And while I didn't want to do that, I was talked into taking on this new role, and that required that I be flexible and that I allow somebody else to take on these other roles that I liked, and for myself to learn this new role and to adapt to a new role. This kind of resistance to changing roles is called role fixation. And this is when we are unable to change or move away from one particular role. So if you've ever gone to a different organization, a different group, and in one group you had a role, you move to a different group and you don't have that same role but you want it and you're focused on it and you refuse to get involved unless you can have that role, that's role fixation, and that ends up creating conflict and creating disturbance within our group. And we have to be thinking about our group as a system. So if you haven't watched it yet, you should watch the lecture on groups as systems or systems theory. Now, when we're thinking about groups as systems, we want to be thinking about them as living, breathing organisms that have input, that have throughput, that have output. And as we increase the complexity of that group, we increase the size of that group, we increase the potential for disturbance. Every new member that enters a group creates some type of disturbance. And when I said that my role in a new group might be a new member role, That's because that is a role, and it's something we have to think about as new members when we're entering an organization, when we're entering a group. We are creating disturbance. We're creating inconsistency in the group. People aren't really sure how the group's going to function. It's a completely new variable, and we have to figure out how to work around that. So every new group member that comes or goes from the organization creates system disturbance, but there are some things that we can do as new members that will allow us to reduce the amount of system disturbance that we have. Now, this is important because for the group to be successful, we have to manage system disturbance. We can't avoid it. It is inevitable, but we have to manage it, and we have to be thinking about how we can manage that. Now, this could be from a leadership position or from a new member position. So either way, you have to be thinking about this if you want to have a positive impact on your group. So some of the factors impacting group new members are group age. So the longer the group is around, the older the group is, the more resistant to change it's going to be, the more susceptible to disturbance it's going to be. Now, at the same time, it's also going to be very stable. So if we have too much disturbance that throws off that group because it's an older, more successful group, then we are really going to have to think about how do we manage that. If it's a newer group that's dynamic and that's used to that change, used to that variability, you might not have as much disturbance within the group. You also have to be thinking about success. So groups that have a history of success, that have a history of positive cooperation, are going to be more heavily impacted by system disturbance. Groups that are not as successful are usually going to be more open to system disturbance. They're going to be able to manage that more effectively simply because they're hopefully going to be looking for a way to be successful. So we have to really be thinking about, as new members, what's the age of the group, what's the history of success with the group, how big is the group. So smaller groups are going to have more system disturbance, whereas larger groups, they might be so large that you don't even realize when somebody stops being a part of that group. So it depends, but smaller groups are going to be more susceptible to system disturbance, whereas larger groups are going to be able to manage that disturbance more effectively, or maybe not even notice it. We then have group member turnover. Now, turnover is really important. This is something that business people know a lot about, especially in recruiting and marketing and HR. But when we have too much turnover, that creates consistent disturbance, and you never have any stability in the group. And this can negatively impact things like satisfaction, things like synergy, things like cohesion. So we have to be thinking about limiting turnover. So we have to be thinking about input, throughput, and output, because those things connect to system disturbance and ultimately can impact our group members' perception. A lot of this comes down to perception. So if we are perceived as being a new member that's going to bring something to the group, that's going to be positive, that's going to be an addition to the group, that will reduce the amount of disturbance. If we enter the group and we're not really seen as being a positive asset, or we are immediately coming in and making waves and causing disturbance, that's not necessarily always a good thing. So we have to be thinking about, what is our perception? All of those things are super important for developing an effective group, developing a cohesive group, but we also have to think about, this is the last major idea in this lecture, we have to think about group socialization. So group disturbance damages cohesion, conformity, and productivity, which, again, not great all the time, but it's also not necessarily bad either. Sometimes we need to shake things up. But when we are thinking about limiting system disturbance, we want to think about socializing our new members, socializing the new members with the old members as quickly as possible, simply because this will reduce the negative impacts of system disturbance. So we have to be thinking about group socialization and making sure that our new members merge with our old members in our group, and we limit those effects of system disturbance. So some of the things that new members can do. So you specifically, if you're a new member in a group, here are some things that you can do. Number one, you can actively attempt to get to know the established group members. So get to know the people that are there. Look for mentorship. Get to know the people that have been around the longest. While those people might not be super receptive because they may have met a lot of new members, they may have have a history with other group members, it's really important to at least try to get to know those group members so that you can increase the consistency, you can increase the trust that you have with those people and how you're going to interact. The second thing you can do is play the role of newcomer, and this means that you listen and follow. You don't act like you know everything. You don't speak as much, right? You might sit back and allow everybody else to talk and just listen, and if somebody asks you about your take on something, then maybe add that in. But don't try to dominate the conversations. Don't try and add in your 2 cents in too many places, because you are new to the group, and what you know about things related to that group might be different than what actually is related to the group. Those variables change, and it depends on the group, the organization, the context of what's going on. So don't be so gung-ho all the time to go in and make your presence known. Sometimes it's okay to sit back and observe and listen and learn. And this is where we learn about the new group norms, and hopefully we embrace those. So when you enter into a group, you have to learn the norms. You have to learn how we communicate, how do we interact, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate. A lot of times we'll have that explicitly stated, but as you know already, we sometimes have implicit roles or implicit norms. And these are things that we have to learn through interaction. So again, be okay with listening, be okay with learning, observe, and try and gain a deeper understanding of how that group's going to work, who the people are within that group, what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. One really effective thing you can do is try to seek mentorship. If you create a relationship with somebody who is an established member of that group, you can hopefully connect with them in a way that allows you to reach out to them. And if you have a question, you can reach out and ask in a more private setting instead of asking in a meeting. If you're not sure about something, or you disagree with something, or you're not sure how to handle a situation, it's a great opportunity to reach out to somebody with experience. This is something that has been really important for me in my teaching career. I never saw myself as being a teacher. I never thought about teaching until I got into graduate school. And once I did that, I had a lot to learn. And one of the things that really helped was having a mentor and having somebody to just talk to and bounce ideas off of and get advice from. And just for example, my favorite professor, I would often ask her, hey, I'm doing this in class and it's not really working. What's your advice? Or how should I handle this challenging situation? One time I had passed out quizzes and I lost 10 or 15 of the quizzes somehow. I don't know how, but I wasn't sure what to do. Do I give everybody an A? Do I redo the quiz? Do we drop the quiz? What do we do? So I went and talked to her, and she said, well, you should probably give everybody an A, because you're not going to be able to assess everybody, but you also made them take the quiz. They took the quiz. They studied. So, and it is just one quiz. It's not a big deal. So here's some of your options, but ultimately it's your decision to make. And for me, that was a really important learning moment, because I had to make a decision that was going to impact my class. I was going to have to answer questions from my students, probably from my boss or my supervisor. Fortunately, I found the quizzes, though, so it wasn't important, and nobody even knew except for my mentor and myself. So having a mentor can work in your favor in a lot of different ways. You can also collaborate with other newcomers, so reach out to people that are new to the group, get to know them, start to build those relationships, start to build that cohesion. Then you can bounce ideas off of each other. And maybe you're having some kind of conflict with a more established group member. It might be helpful to have somebody else, that's got your back when it comes to that particular situation. If you have a mentor, you have somebody that you know who's also newer to the group, you're starting to create your own network, create your own relationship, your own connection within that group. So in review, roles in groups, again, they're really important, but this is pretty simple stuff. And if you think about your own experiences in different groups, teams, and organizations, I'm sure that you can highlight different different issues related to role status and power and influence. Relate to different issues in role conflict where you feel that tension between one role and another, and sometimes you can't fulfill both of them. So you have to be adaptable. You have to be willing to adjust your role. That's where that role adaptability and avoiding role fixation comes into play, because when we create too much disturbance in our system, it can negatively impact the way that we function as a group, and that functionality, that disturbance, oftentimes comes from new members. So we have to be thinking about how do we socialize new members, how do we socialize our group to reduce our system disturbance. And overall, this material, again, pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but if you think about it, this is all relatable to all of our interactions in different groups, different teams, different organizations. And I really encourage you to try out some different roles. Try doing some of these things. If you're a new member to a group, think about how you can adapt, how you can gain mentorship, how you can learn, how you can listen without creating too much disturbance within the group. I hope you learned something from this, and I look forward to talking with you again.